Hey everyone, welcome to an Advanced Sports Analytics live stream. Today is Monday, May 3rd. Brandon is out today, so you have just me. I'm going to go over the MLB slate today on SuperDraft. It's a 9-game slate, I believe, starting at 7:40 p.m. So you have a little bit of extra time. That early game between Milwaukee and Philadelphia is not on the slate, so it should be a pretty tight slate, not that many games, all starting within kind of a similar time band. So hopefully we get all lineups locked before 7:40 lock. Also want to, since Brandon's not on the show, figured it'd be a good opportunity to do a little screen share and kind of tutorial. A lot of times I know in these shows we're talking about players and kind of plays and some numbers, some projections, etc. I think it maybe makes sense to just kind of show some of the stuff that we're looking at, some of the tools that we're using through ASA as part of those data points and notes. And I think also just give you an idea of how maybe I think about constructing tournament lineups on SuperDraft for MLB. Unlike basketball, MLB is a highly correlative sport. So when building tournament lineups, we do when building by hand, we want to impose correlation rules, kind of mental notes that will generate correlated lineups when trying to build lineups at scale. 5+ lineups, I think building by hand can become tedious, and using an optimizer effectively to get some of those correlated builds that you want, avoid negative correlation. Understanding how to use an optimizer well, I think, is an important component of that, on top of having good projections that you're using. So want to do a screen share, which let's see if I can figure out how to do that. All right, so in the ASA site, our MLB tools are under the MLB tab. We use the high heat projections. That is a projection set as well as a tool with optimization functions built into it that allows you to build, tournament viable or cash game viable lineups at scale. I guess building cash game lineups at scale isn't super. It's not like a need to scale process. You can obviously do that by hand. But for tournament purposes, I really like the tool that we have. It's pretty simple. I think there are other effective optimizers out there that have, more or less kind of customization. I like, our tool, I think, has enough customization functions and features, but also not overwhelming as far as use. So opening up the tool for SuperDraft, we want to select the SD site. And then we can just tab over to projections and get a sense of how we're projecting different players for the slate. For those that aren't maybe familiar with SuperDraft, the key component with SuperDraft is that all players have a multiplier attached to their fantasy production, and their fantasy value is a product of their overall raw fantasy points, which we have in this SDP column. So as you can see, some of the best players have the highest raw projected fantasy points, multiplied that times their multiplier. Naturally, some of the best players, especially when looking at batters, some of the highest raw projected batters, Betts, Story, Belt, who's playing at Colorado, La Stella at Colorado. But looking mostly like at some of these guys like Story, Betts, McMahon, Corey Seager, Jose Ramirez, Turner. The better players have the lower multipliers, and some of the higher multiplier players have lower raw totals. If we sort on multiplier, see that 1.8, Kyle Lewis is the highest multiplier. Some of these guys don't have, the highest raw totals, but, when we multiply raw totals by multiplier, you get kind of a healthy mix of players who bubble to the top of this value column, which is just raw projection times multiplier. And we see kind of the guys that our projection system likes the most as far as raw fantasy points times their multiplier. And as mentioned, there's kind of a mix. We have a lot of at Colorado guys on the San Francisco side. Of course, some of the guys on the Colorado side playing in Colorado, and then a sprinkling of guys like Hayes, who's projected to bat second at a high multiplier and a reasonably productive hitter. Mullins batting leadoff at Seattle, but then also low multiplier guys like Betts, 1.05. Maybe the second, I think we saw Cruz at 1x, but Betts is second lowest multiplier player. But our projections suggest for good reason, even when we multiply his raw points 10.21 times the 1.05 multiplier, he's still towards the top of our value column. I would guess that's because, yes, he has the highest raw projection on the slate. So if you're building by hand and kind of just want to scroll through the projections and kind of see what players you like, you can do that for tournament purposes. You can sort by value and see kind of which teams are bubbling to the top. So we're seeing this trio of San Francisco guys at the top of the lineup. So that makes for a pretty good tournament stack where you could put 3 of those guys, or even add Longoria and make it 4 into a lineup, and then kind of fill in around those guys. Or for cash game purposes, SuperDraft is actually pretty simple. If you were to run optimize in the optimals tab and get our optimal lineup, which is at the top, it's really just the 6 guys that sort to the top when we sort on value. So, Maeda and Buehler at the top, they're both of the pitchers. Listella, Belt, Dickerson, Tapia, Hayes, Arias, top 6 hitters, all at the top there. If you're using a salaried format like DraftKings or FanDuel, it's not going to be quite that simple. But the optimize function should, generate lineups in the optimals tab should allow you to create the lineups with the highest projection without any rules. And then if you're, looking at it by position, you can see which players bubble to the top by position. That being said, for SuperDraft, where there is no specific hitter positions, there are just hitters and pitchers. There's less concern with some of this positional stuff, but I do think it makes sense for other formats where you do have to fill certain positions. One good way to just get a sense of how stacks are and how teams are stacking up is in our lineup stacks tab, which just aggregates the post multiplier projection of all lineups and sorts on value. So Baltimore, Cleveland, teams are at the top. San Francisco, which we touched on, they aren't quite at the top. So perhaps they have, another key component is you can filter by stuff. So like if I type in SFG, we can see, they have like 4 guys towards the top that have really strong projections, but the bottom 3, and I guess there's one person missing who maybe we have to add to our player set. They might not project quite as well. Also by only having 7 guys and missing that 8th hitter. So that could be like a StatCast key issue that we can fix up. Maybe that's kind of why they're sinking lower. But Baltimore looks like strong stacks, Cleveland, Colorado, and Colorado. So if you're building by hand and kind of want to get a quick sense or layout of what teams are showing the strongest projections as a whole for stacking purposes, using this lineup stack tab could be a good way to go. For tournament purposes, I rely just heavily on the tools and crunching the numbers using rules and the optimization function to generate the lineups that I want. So we can kind of go through some of the different features that are available to people who are creating lineups using our optimizer and projections. I'm going to set the number of optimals to 5 just to keep the runtime down. I can go over kind of some runtime caveats when we kind of get there. So one rule that I am almost always using for tournament purposes, unless the slate is particularly small, is preventing pitchers from being rostered in the same lineup with other players who would figure to negatively correlate with those pitchers. The default settings are to allow all players to be rostered with all other players. This is fine for cash, but for tournaments, I really never want to roster a pitcher against an opposing hitter unless like if it's a very, very small slate, like a 2 or 3 game slate, where putting this rule in place will kind of really restrict your lineups. I mean, if there's 2 games and you have to roster 2 pitchers, by preventing pitchers from being rostered with other hitters that they're going up against, you're really shrinking your player pool. Or for showdown purposes, like last night, I think SuperDraft ran a showdown contest for the Mets-Phillies games, and the winning lineup had both Peterson and Eflin in the lineup, and you couldn't have both those guys in the lineup with this rule on, because you naturally would have to fill out the lineup with some hitters, and you wouldn't be able to roster both those guys with hitters from either side in. So as the slate shrinks, I think taking kind of a more condensed approach, or avoiding these over-condensed approaches, kind of makes sense. But for the 9-game slate, like, I definitely don't want to be rostering batters versus opposing pitchers. The negative correlation should be pretty obvious there. For a hitter to succeed, they have to get hits, score runs, steal bases, produce, and that is always going to come at is likely to come at the expense of the starting pitcher. There are obviously routes to, the starting pitcher just shutting it down for like 7 innings, and the hitter, like, I don't know, putting up a really productive couple at bats or so against the bullpen. But those paths kind of feel slim. So I'm always going to want to avoid rostering batters versus pitchers. There's a case to be made for avoiding rostering pitchers that are going against one another, that both of them can't get wins. I typically avoid this rule, though. I mean, I think there are kind of game factors that maybe contribute rather to pitchers within the same game correlating and kind of succeeding or failing together. The weather is kind of the most notable example here. Weather and park factor, if pitchers are both pitching at a low kind of run park factor or high strikeout park factor, it can be fine to roster pitchers in the same game that are going up against one another. You obviously trade some win equity, but there are opportunities, I think, for that trade-off to kind of be worth it. Umpire being another example. If it's kind of a umpire that has an elevated number of strikeouts that they observe, rostering pitchers from the same game that are going up against one another makes sense. So I like throwing that rule in there, and it's not going to be an issue because Buehler and Maeda aren't going up against one another. But as you expand your lineups and they're kind of a more diverse mix of pitchers, this rule can be helpful. Speaking of diversity, I want to talk about ways to promote diversity in your lineup. So, like, for example, the moonshot tonight on SuperDraft, I believe, is a max entry of 5. Yes. If you're just building 5 optimal lineups without rules that promote diversity, you're going to get a lot of this. You're just going to get the same set or pair of pitchers, maybe 3 different pitchers in your mix of 5 lineups. And look, I mean, if you have conviction in 2 pitchers kind of above the rest of the field, like, I don't want to say that is not the correct approach. I think it's all kind of just a diversity or lack thereof, tolerance thing. And I know for me, I like to have some diversity in my lineups. I don't want to submit 5 lineups into one contest that have all the same pitchers, because if any one of those pitchers duds, I have no chance of winning anything. The I think counter argument you could make is that, well, if you have conviction in Buehler and Maeda and both of them have great games, you're just in an incredible position to win first place. You kind of have 5 shots to get the right combo of hitters. So I don't want to talk anyone off of, not having diversification in their lineups, but just kind of explain the pros and cons of promoting diversity or being okay with kind of lack of diversity in your lineups. So there's kind of 3 different ways that we can promote diversity in our builds. The first is the number of differentiators. So, I see other optimizers where they call these uniques or something like that. It's just like, if you look at these 2 lineups, you can see that they differ by only 1 player. So it looks like the difference here is trading Arias for Cesar Hernandez. Other than that, the lineups are identical. If we were to set differentiators to some other number, we would have lineups that differ by at least 3 players. So we can see now in these two, we have the same 2 pitchers. We have Belt in both. We have LaStella in both. And we have Dickerson in both. So then the 3 differentiators are Hayes versus Mullins, Arias versus Hernandez, and Betts versus Tapia. And then naturally, so like we also have an exposures tab where you can see the exposure you have to each player. We can see now we have 5 lineups with 14 different players in those lineups. If we were to set differentiators down to 1, we now have 5 lineups with only 10 unique players. 5 of those players have 100% exposure there in all 5 of lineups. So yeah, differentiators is one way to get a little more diversity. I find it kind of takes some of these not fringy players, but mid to lower exposure players in like the 50% range, and ratchets their exposure down and adds a couple players who are kind of just outside of the player pool. And it still keeps exposure pretty high on some of these near lock button or lock button players, like the pitchers. Okay, so it looks like we lost one Buehler lineup. So Frankie Montas, I guess, in this last one got in over Buehler. So yeah, that's kind of how the differentiator works. I don't find myself using it too much. I kind of like to get diversification through some of these other features, specifically bounce and randomness. So the idea with randomness is that, if there are multiple people who are using the same optimizer with the same projections, with the same set of rules, everyone is going to be generating the same 5 lineups who is using those projections with those rules. So that would be ASA subscribers. Our projections are available on Fantasy Labs. So Fantasy Lab subscribers who are using the same or similar kind of rule settings. There's opportunity for a lot of duplication, which is to be avoided, or we should seek to avoid duplication for tournament purposes. So adding randomness will just, as the term suggests, add randomness to projections with each optimal run. So each attempt at generating kind of the next best lineup that hasn't yet been created will inject some degree of randomness. So that's kind of how that works. You can, and I believe kind of the math in it is that the randomness coefficient or number is we take the projection, a player's projection, and then take a random sample from a normal distribution around that projection with a standard deviation of X% of that player's projection. So a normal distribution, or a sample from a normal distribution with the standard deviation of 0 is just going to be that projection. A random sample from a normal distribution where the standard deviation is 10% of the projection, will be medium to kind of low amount of randomness. And we can already see that we have, when we do randomness, Maeda, his projection is so strong that even when we add noise in there, he's still appearing in, all of the 5 lineups. Buehler is shrinking a little bit. And then we get some of these other guys who have high projections, but when we are being, perfectly optimal in our construction, don't filter in. But when we add some randomness, there are ways to, they're high enough where high projection with, positive randomness allows them to slip into lineups. And the good thing about the randomness is that every user's randomization of projections is going to be different. So, it's very unlikely that if someone else were to use these same rules, even if with randomness at 10%, they might have similar exposures, but they just might not get the mix of players in, the lineups kind of exactly as this build has it. So it's one way to maybe move off of being perfectly optimal, but giving yourself the ability to avoid duplication with high confidence. So, the trade-off is using extremely high randomness will move you far off the optimal, but give you next to 0 chance of duplication. Lower randomness, you're moving kind of less off optimal, but there's kind of higher chance for either exact duplication or just high, correlation between your lineup and other people's lineups. I never really go over like 10 or 15% because I like to, the tournaments are small enough and I'm not sure on SuperDraft play is super optimal. That I'm okay with not being super different from others. I kind of hope that by setting some rules and playing in the smallish tournaments, that there's just pretty low chance of duplication. I have found that to be the case. So we can keep randomness at like 5%. So bounce is another feature that should promote. I'm going to set to 0 just for purpose of the exercise. Actually, bounce is something that should promote diversification. So as we can see, there are a lot of players that have 100% exposure. Bounce is a good way to lower exposure to players and prevent them from appearing in all or next to all lineups. The mathematics behind it is, a player has a projection. When there's 0 bounce, we try to create optimal lineups. And that naturally, with kind of the positional formatting of SuperDraft in particular, is not going to lead to that much diversity. We're really just going to, a lot of times, as you can see, there's this core of 5 players who appear in all lineups, and then they're just kind of taking 1v1s or 2v2s elsewhere. What bounce will do is every time a player, the optimizer attempts to build lineups kind of linearly, in that it will build the best lineup and then attempt to build the next best lineup that is different from the best lineup. What bounce will do, and I can just run, I'll turn pitcher bounce up to 25 to kind of show you what high bounce can do. Just to show you kind of the end result. Now we have Maeda at 60%, Buehler at 60%, and then Montas at 40%, and then Matz and Glasnow also at 20%. So what bounce will do is it'll say, all right, we are rostering Buehler and Maeda and all these other 6 hitters in the lineup. We'll just talk about pitchers in the first lineup. In subsequent builds, reduce their projection by 25%, and then build the next best lineup with those reduced projections. And then the next best lineup, 75%, 75% Kenta Maeda is still one of the top 2 pitchers in our player pool. But 25% or 75% Buehler isn't better than 100% Montas. So we're going to take Montas over Buehler. In the subsequent builds, players that have a decreased or kind of bounced projection that aren't featured in the prior build will receive a projection regeneration. So they get half of their 25% back, such that for the third build, Walker Buehler's projection is now at 87.5%. So he went down to 75% and then regenerated to plus 12.5, 87.5. And then since Buehler's not featured in the third lineup, he'll regenerate half of the difference between his full projection, 100%, and 87.5%, which is 12.5%. So he'll regenerate by 6.25%, and so on and so forth until the build is complete. Maeda was featured in the third lineup, so 75% Maeda. Or I'm sorry, 75% Maeda was featured in the second lineup. So then 75 or minus 25% of 75% Maeda, that would be, I don't know, that's hard math. Let's see, 0.75 divided by 4 would be, I'm sorry, 0.25. I don't know. Yeah, that's tricky math. But so you have 75% Maeda, and then he is reduced by 25% of 75. So it'd just be 0.75 squared. So now on your fourth build, you have 56% Maeda. And at that point, a half projection for Maeda just isn't, is beaten out by multiple people. It's beaten out by, 87.5% plus 6.25. So like 93% Buehler, and is beaten out by 100% Matt. So that's kind of how the balance works. As you can see, the higher the balance, the more diversity we get. Lower bounce, like if we only did 5%, I would expect to get, full Maeda and nearly full Buehler. And then you can do it for pitcher and hitters. So, you could do something like 25% bounce. So if you wanted to be super diverse at pitcher, but maybe have a little more restrictive hitter pool, you could set hitter bounce at 10%. Keep in mind, though, that there are more hitters. So like relatively speaking, 25% bounce on pitcher means that they're still only competing with, like on a 9-game slate, only 17 other pitchers. A 10% bounce on hitter, they're competing with like 8 times 9, 70 plus hitters. So, something to note. But anyways, you can see how, the bounce on hitters will promote a little more diversity at hitter. We don't have any hitters that are full on locks. And it's interesting that like Garcia now has kind of bubbled to the top. So yeah, you can see how like 10% bounce on hitters actually promotes more diversity than 25% bounce on pitchers. So, something to note, like maybe we'll dial it down a little bit. So that's a way to promote diversity. We talked about avoiding negative correlation. One of the keys to MLB lineup construction is achieving positive correlation in your lineups. We want to stack lineups. The idea being that when hitters collect fantasy points by driving in runs, be it a hit or a home run, or you want the players that they drive in, you want their run benefit. If they steal a base to get in a scoring position, you want kind of the cumulative or correlated positive outcomes that can occur in a game. And sometimes it's, MLB DFS can be less about picking the right players and more about just picking the right team, or picking the right kind of set of players. So that's where the lineup stacking tab comes into play. So if we wanted to have all of our lineups that had, we want all 5 of our lineups to have at least a stack of at least 3 players from one team. What all will do is it'll cycle through all the teams, find the best lineup that can be created by each team, in which 3+ players are rostered from that team, and say, all right, what is the best of these sets of lineups that cycle through all the teams? And when we run it, it runs through, and you can see the top lineup here has at least 3 Dodgers. So it's got Seager, Turner, Smith. The next lineup, since we do have bounce on, will go now to, it looks like, the Giants, La Stella, Crawford, Posey. The next set will go to, this is looking like the Mets, Lindor, Nimmo, Dominic Smith. So that's a good way to generate lineups. And, it's cool when you put the bounce on there, you get kind of different sets of players, which is nice, and I think has good lineup diversity. Let's say, though, you wanted just specific stacks. Let's say we wanted only Baltimore, Cleveland, San Francisco, Colorado, and Seattle. Those were the only teams that we wanted to build our stacks from. We could type in those individual names and we would get lineups that mimic kind of those specific pools. So that's nice too, and kind of a nice way to do it. But I like cycling through all. I think it just is a good catch-all. So one component of all this, like looking at Seager, Turner, Will Smith, I'm not sure where they're batting. They're probably all batting similarly together. But okay, let's just say like you have these 3 guys and there is a gap. I don't think 2, 3, 5 is like a bad gap to have, but I don't know. I might want to avoid lineups that are like Smith, Seager, and then like the 8 hitter and Chris Taylor. There's just so many gaps between the hitters. We can count it. We're skipping the 3-hole hitter and the 4. And then we're skipping 6, 7, 8. So it's kind of like a lot of gaps to cover for a lineup to work out. The thinking is that if all 3 of these guys are going to succeed, it's actually kind of likely that the players who bat in between them are also likely to have some level of success. So sometimes it can be useful to prevent large amount of gaps between hitters. For SuperDraft, I like doing either 2 or 1. 1 obviously keeps your stacks tighter together, but sometimes can be restrictive. And I think 2 is kind of, for me, the good mix of finding stacks that are bunched together in a productive way, but also not being too restrictive and, not forcing yourself to get like hitters 1, 2, and 4 when maybe, like 1, 3, and 5 are kind of the best hitters, something like that. So I like going 2. Sometimes I'll go 1. depending on the slate and kind of who some of the top hitters are and how close they are together. But yeah, as you can see, like all these lineups will have hitters and stacks. So obviously that Seager, Turner, Smith stack fits the bill of, you know, having less than 2 batting gaps between. I think there's 1. We're skipping the 4. Doesn't seem to have like that many changes for the most part. Batters at the top of the batting order have high projections, so naturally there's going to be kind of some inherent bunching that occurs. But if you're building at scale, you know, up to like 70 lineups, I think the quarter tonight on SuperDraft has a max of 70. You know, you are going to, and you're not promoting some degree of bunching, you are going to get maybe some overly sparse stacks that you might want to avoid. So I like doing that. And then you can also, you know, do 2-team stacks. So like, let's say we wanted to build, you know, lineups that have, you know, 2 pairs of players that are batting within 2 slots of each other, maybe that are batting within 1, you know, so like, for example, a 2 and a 4 hitter, or a 1 and a 3, 3 and a 5, something like that. We can do, you know, second stacks where we do all, and then we have at least 2 hitters from each of these stacks. And we'll generate lineups. So take a note that this runs a bit slower. The computational complexity of kind of these functions are that, as mentioned, we cycle through every team that is selected. So, you know, it took, I don't know, what was that, like 20, 30 seconds. But you can see how that was just to build 5 lineups. If you're trying to build 70 lineups, you know, you're looking at like 1 to 3 minutes of runtime, depending on how restrictive you are. What the function will do is we'll cycle through all teams, try to find the best lineup that is achievable where all combinations of teams are fulfilled. So figure there are, what we say, nine games, so 18 teams. You know, the number of combinations are 18 squared. So, I mean, you're dealing with, what, 324 loops through to find the best 5 sets. And then there's also this batting gaps logical statement that needs to be filled. So for some instances, you know, a lineup that fills the rules that we're setting might not be reached, where, you know, the build for, I don't know, Baltimore and Cleveland chooses 2 guys that are more than 1 lineup slot apart. So we'll have to re-loop through that. So these things can add up. You know, all these little like restrictive rules that we impose can add up as we increase the number of players, like in a stack. You know, all this stuff kind of computationally adds up. So when I'm using the tool for like building 5 lineups, you know, I kind of just build 5 lineups. But like, for example, if I wanted to submit 70 lineups to the quarter, like we can already see that this is, you know, running slightly more timely than the previous run. I think a good rule of thumb is to set the rules that you want, you know, build lineups the way that you want, and then just try running for like 3 to 5 optimals and just see how long it takes to run, and understand that, you know, sometimes rules can be so restrictive that it's not possible to build 70 lineups, given the rules that are in place. And the app like won't tell you that you've kind of reached terminal, you know, computation, and there's like, we can't find 70 lineups. So I think it's good to like, or maybe the build is just will take way longer than kind of you can afford time wise. I find good to set the rules that I want, you know, run it on like 3 to 5 optimals, make sure things run through, make sure it runs through in kind of a somewhat timely fashion. And then if I like those rules, you know, and you can also look at kind of the lineups they build. Do they fit some of the features that you want in a lineup? If it runs through in kind of a timely manner, then go ahead and build, you know, 20 lineups or so, or 70 lineups, or, you know, whatever. So I think that's a good rule of thumb. The last feature I think I want to point out is just the CSV upload capability. We make it pretty easy where you can just download CSV. It will have the lineups that you have built. in the raw kind of uploadable form with player keys, all that good stuff. And you can just upload these like straight into contests. So, if I wanted to enter these 5 lineups into the moonshot, I believe you can just upload them straight in there. And yeah, it'll upload, submit. So a really good way to upload lineups at scale. Or if you have upcoming lineups that you want to edit in CSV format, you can download your upcoming lineup CSV, build the lineups that you want. You can reserve your seats or whatever in a contest. Build the lineups you want, paste them into the upload CSV or lineup edit CSV, and then upload those right back into SuperDraft. Really good way to kind of manage lineups at scale. So yeah, I encourage you guys to check that out. If you are trying to submit, many lineups through an optimizer, the MME download and upload functionality, I think is, pretty slick. And I know like optimizers across the industry have that functionality. So, you can use that in your optimizer of choice as well. So anyways, yeah, I hope that gives you a sense of, sorry, I know it's kind of, in a vacuum, but hope that gives you a sense of how to use the MLB optimizer, how to use projections to build lineups by hand, or how to use an optimizer to build lineups at scale. Either for manual kind of hand entry, you can kind of comb over the set of lineups that you have and say, all right, what's maybe wrong with these 5 lineups and what adjustments or edits can I make? Or if you are taking, the MME upload route, we hope that our tools kind of make it functional for doing that on SuperDraft. Yeah, so I encourage you guys to check that out. Fun 9-game slate tonight. They got contests for varying size, varying price points. They have the moonshot, I think, is a good kind of small, small contest, 500. Was it 500? No, that's the solo shot. That's 575. Because I just submit, I can't now see what the moonshot is. I think it's probably smaller. I think it's like 1 to 200. So, good chances of winning. Like, with these large, take the quarter, for example, which is a cheap price point, 25 cents, but you can, upload 70 lineups. But, 2,300 person field. If you're not MMEing, if you're only uploading 5 lineups, you're at pretty long odds to win. I think it's going to take a long time to realize your expected value, even if you are a plus EV player, building good tournament lineups. Obviously you still have to get lucky to win some of these tournaments. So I would say though that some of these smaller field tournaments like the moonshot, like the solo shot, by virtue of being smaller tournaments should have quicker kind of expected value realization for people who are submitting plus EV lineups. So yeah, I encourage you guys to check that out on SuperDraft tonight. We will be back later this week to do some NBA talk. We'll continue doing the MLB stuff every once in a while. Maybe some PGA talk ahead of the Wells Fargo Champ this weekend. I know SuperDraft on Thursday is having some single game NBA GPPs that maybe we could do some discussion about single game strategy. So we'll be back Wednesday to talk, a smattering of some of those topics and contest types. So encourage you to tune in then. So yeah, till next time, guys.